Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. This week we're really going deep trying to figure out, is this guy a grifter or is he gifted?
Hmm.
Today we're diving into the life and times of Kyle Rittenhouse,
Oh, yeah, he's a big
a
one.
very controversial figure, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely.
Somebody who really kind of took the country by storm back in the summer of 2020.
And still to this day, I feel
And
it.
still to this day is a figure that people have very strong opinions on.
Oh, yeah. Love him or hate him, everybody knows his name and has some thoughts about him.
Exactly. And so we've got a ton of sources here today, really trying to dive deep. We've got court documents. We've got firsthand accounts from that night in Kenosha.
Mm-hmm.
We've even got some psychological research that we're going to bring into the mix here
Oh, wow.
to really try to understand like what happened here with Kyle Rittenhouse.
Yeah, what led him to that point,
Yeah.
to be in that situation? Was it calculated or is it just a series of he had decisions?
Yeah. And what does it say about him as a person?
Hmm.
Is he truly, a misguided youth, or is he a dangerous vigilante?
And does the story tell us something about America today?
Exactly. So let's rewind the clock here.
Yeah.
Go back to August of 2020,
Okay.
Kenosha, Wisconsin.
The scene is set?
The city was already on edge following the police shooting of Jacob Blake, a black man.
That's right.
And this wasn't just like any other shooting, though, right? Like this really ignited a powder keg across the country.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the video of the shooting went viral. Protests erupted all over the U.S., and obviously the situation on the ground in Kenosha was incredibly tense.
Yeah, it was a tinderbox.
You had protests, riots, property damage. There was a sense of anger, fear, uncertainty in the air. You could just feel it.
Yeah, it sounds like just absolute chaos.
It was.
So into this very chaotic scene steps a 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, armed with an AR-15 style rifle.
I mean, talk about walking into the lion's den.
Right. And we know that from our sources that Rittenhouse had kind of a long-standing fascination with law enforcement and firearms.
Oh, yeah, big time.
There's a photo that really made the rounds online of him as a young boy posing with an AR-15.
It's a pretty shocking image when you think about the context of everything that happened later on.
For sure. And,
Yeah.
His social media was full of this kind of Blue Lives Matter content. And he talked openly about wanting to be a police officer.
It seemed like he was almost idolizing law enforcement and had this very romanticized view of what it meant to be a cop.
Yeah, and so he comes to Kenosha with this very specific worldview, right? And claims that he wants to protect property and provide first aid.
Which is a pretty bold claim for a 17-year-old kid with no real training or authority.
Right. He wasn't a trained EMT. He wasn't part of any official response team.
Nope, just a kid with a gun, basically.
It's a bit like playing soldier, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially considering the kind of online chatter at the time, encouraging armed citizens to defend Kenosha from so-called evil thugs.
It's almost like he got caught up in this vigilante fantasy fueled by social media.
So did Rittenhouse see himself as part of a militia? Like a vigilante stepping in where law enforcement was failing?
Well, he wasn't officially part of any organized militia group, but he was seen interacting with armed groups that night, including one led by Ryan Balch, who was an Army veteran.
Okay, so not officially, but kind of running in those circles.
Well, definitely rubbing shoulders with some pretty extreme elements.
That's interesting. So before we get into the events of that night, I think we need to talk about this concept called the weapons effect that you highlighted in the research.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating one.
This idea that just the mere presence of a weapon can increase aggression and make people more likely to interpret ambiguous situations as threatening.
It's like the gun itself changes the way you perceive the world around you.
Yeah. What do we know about this?
Well, there's a whole body of research on this, and studies have shown that even just seeing a weapon can trigger this physiological response in people, like increased heart rate adrenaline.
So your body's basically getting primed for fight or flight.
Exactly. And that can lead to what psychologists call attentional narrowing, where your focus becomes fixated on the weapon.
But you're not seeing the bigger picture.
Right, your brain is basically telling you danger, focus on the threat, and you're less able to process other information in your environment.
So you might misinterpret someone's actions or intentions.
Precisely because your judgment is clouded by this fear response.
That's scary.
It is, and it's something to keep in mind as we unpack the events of that night in Kenosha, because you've got a young man armed with a rifle in an incredibly tense and chaotic situation.
Right, and we know that he's already predisposed to seeing the world through this lens of us versus them, good guys versus bad guys.
Exactly. So the potential for things to go wrong is incredibly high.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster almost.
You could say that.
Okay, so let's dig into the events of that night. What happened?
All right, so the night of August 25th, 2020, things really come to a head. You have all these different groups out on the streets. You have protesters, you have counter-protesters, you have armed militia types, you have people just trying to protect their businesses.
And everyone is on edge. Everyone is amped up.
Right, it's a volatile mix.
Okay, so where does Rittenhouse fit into all of this?
Well, he's patrolling the streets with his AR-15, claiming to be there to protect property.
But he's not affiliated with any official group, right?
No, not officially, but he's hanging out with this group led by Ryan Balch, the Army veteran we mentioned earlier.
Okay.
So they're at this used car lot called Car Source, supposedly guarding it against potential vandalism.
And then what happens?
Things escalate pretty quickly. There's a dumpster fire nearby, and Rittenhouse gets involved in trying to put it out.
Okay.
And this is where the first confrontation occurs. He encounters Joseph Rosenbaum, who's unarmed, and things get heated.
Okay, so we're gonna really break down this first confrontation in detail in just a moment.
Right, because it's a pivotal moment in the whole story.
But first, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Okay, so we're back, and we left off with Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha during the unrest, and he's just gotten into his first confrontation.
Right, with Joseph Rosenbaum.
So break down this first shooting for us.
Yeah, so Rosenbaum, he was, I think, 36 years old at the time, and he was unarmed.
Okay.
And there are varying accounts of exactly what happened leading up to the shooting.
Right, because it was chaos.
Exactly. There was a lot going on. People were yelling. There were fireworks going off. It was a very confusing and chaotic scene.
So what do we know for sure?
Well, we know that there was some sort of altercation between Rittenhouse and Rosenbaum.
Right.
Witnesses say that Rosenbaum was acting erratically and may have been shouting threats at Rittenhouse,
Right.
but it's unclear whether he actually posed an imminent threat to Rittenhouse's life.
Right.
And that's the key question here, because Rittenhouse's entire self-defense claim hinges on the idea that he was in a reasonable fear of death or serious bodily harm.
Yeah, if Rosenbaum was just yelling but wasn't actually attacking him, then Rittenhouse didn't have a legal justification to shoot.
Exactly.
So what happened next?
Well, Rittenhouse fires 4 shots at Rosenbaum, hitting him multiple times.
And Rosenbaum dies from his injuries.
That's right.
Okay, so now Rittenhouse has just killed a man.
And things are about to spiral even further out of control.
So what happens after the first shooting?
Well, after shooting Rosenbaum, Rittenhouse takes off running down the street.
He's fleeing the scene.
Yeah, and a crowd starts chasing after him.
They've just seen him shoot someone.
Right. So they're probably thinking he's a dangerous shooter.
And what does Rittenhouse do?
He trips and falls to the ground, and as he's trying to get back up, Anthony Huber, who was part of the group chasing him, tries to grab Rittenhouse's gun,
Okay.
and Rittenhouse shoots him.
So that's the second shooting.
That's right. Huber is also fatally wounded.
And then what?
A third man, Gage Grosskreutz, approaches Rittenhouse holding a handgun.
Okay, so this guy has a gun too.
Yeah, and there's some debate about whether he was pointing it at Rittenhouse or not.
But Rittenhouse shoots him anyway.
Yes, he shoots Grosskreutz in the arm, wounding him but not killing him.
So that's 3 people shot, and 2 of them dead in the span of just a few minutes.
It was an incredibly chaotic and violent sequence of events.
And it all happened because a 17-year-old kid decided to walk into a riot zone with an AR-15.
It's a tragedy on so many levels.
So what happens to Rittenhouse after the shootings?
Well, he manages to escape the immediate scene and turns himself in to the police later that night.
Oh, okay.
And that's when a legal battle begins.
Yeah, because now he's facing some very serious charges.
Absolutely. He's charged with 5 felonies, including first-degree intentional homicide.
The whole country is watching.
Oh, yeah. This case becomes a national sensation. It's on every news channel, every website. Everyone is talking about Kyle Rittenhouse.
And it really taps into these deep divisions in American society.
Absolutely. You have people on one side who see him as a hero, a young man who stood up for law and order and protected himself from a dangerous mob.
And on the other side, you have people who see him as a dangerous vigilante, a wannabe cop who went looking for trouble and ended up killing 2 people.
And those 2 narratives just clash head-on in the media and in the courtroom.
So how does the trial play out?
Well, the trial itself is incredibly tense and dramatic.
Okay.
The prosecution argues that Rittenhouse provoked the confrontations and acted recklessly with a deadly weapon.
And what does the defense argue?
They maintain that he acted in self-defense, that he was genuinely afraid for his life, and that he only fired his weapon as a last resort.
So it really comes down to this question of whether the jury believes that Rittenhouse was reasonably in fear for his life.
Exactly. That's the crux of the case.
And what does the jury decide?
After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury acquits Rittenhouse on all charges.
Not guilty on all counts.
That's right.
Wow, that must have been a shocking verdict for a lot of people.
It was a very polarizing verdict. For those who saw Rittenhouse as a villain, the acquittal was seen as a miscarriage of justice.
And for his supporters, it was a victory for self-defense and Second Amendment rights.
Exactly. The verdict just further inflamed the divisions that were already so apparent in this case.
And it sparked a whole new round of debate about race, guns, and justice in America.
The Rittenhouse case became a Rorschach test for people's beliefs about the country.
Yeah, it seems like everyone was projecting their own worldview onto this case.
It's almost like we were having two completely separate conversations about the same event.
So where does this leave Kyle Rittenhouse?
Well, he's a free man, acquitted of all charges. But he's also a lightning rod, a symbol of everything that's wrong with America, according to some.
He's been called a hero, a villain, a pawn, a victim. It's hard to know what to make of him.
He's a complex figure, and there are no easy answers when it comes to understanding his story.
So after all this deep diving into his life and the events that thrust him into the spotlight, are we any closer to answering the question, is Kyle Rittenhouse grifter or gifted? That's a tough one, right? I mean, are we looking at a grifter or are we looking at a gifted individual?
Yeah, it's not a simple answer, is it?
It doesn't seem like it.
I mean, human beings are complex, and Kyle Rittenhouse is no exception. He's made some incredibly serious mistakes, but he's also a product of his environment, his upbringing, the deeply polarized world we live in.
It's hard to disentangle all those things, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what makes this case so fascinating and so frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, his actions resulted in the death of 2 people and the injury of a 3rd.
Yeah.
Even if you believe that he was acting in self-defense, there's still a recklessness to his behavior that's hard to ignore.
Absolutely. There's a lack of judgment there, for sure. And I think that's where some of the debate around the gifter aspect comes in, because some people point to his acquittal as proof that he did nothing wrong.
Right, like, the system worked, he was found not guilty, so it's all good.
Exactly. But even if you agree with the jury's verdict, you can still question the choices that led him to that moment. Why was he there? Why was he carrying a rifle? Why did he insert himself into such a volatile situation?
Yeah, the legal outcome doesn't necessarily address the moral and ethical questions surrounding his actions.
Right. And I think that's something Rittenhouse himself seems to be struggling with. He's given interviews where he talks about the emotional toll of the shootings and the trial, but there's this sense that he hasn't fully grappled with the consequences of what happened.
Right, like he's not really taking responsibility for his role in the tragedy.
Yeah, it's almost like he's still stuck in the self-defense narrative and hasn't really confronted the deeper issues at play.
It's interesting, too, how he's used his platform since the acquittal, right? He's aligned himself with certain political groups. He's appeared at rallies. He's embraced the hero narrative that some have constructed around him.
And that's where the grifter argument gains some traction. Is he genuinely committed to these causes? Or is he simply using this tragedy to build a following and advance his own interests?
Like, is he playing the victim card to gain sympathy and notoriety?
It's hard to say for sure. It's possible he truly believes in the things he's saying, but it's also possible that he's learned how to manipulate the media and exploit people's emotions for his own gain.
It's almost impossible to know what's going on in his head.
Right. And I think that's one of the challenges of this case, is that it's so easy to get caught up in the speculation and the projections.
It's like everyone wants to put him in a box, either hero or villain.
Exactly. And the truth is probably somewhere in between. He's a flawed human being who made some terrible choices, but he's also a product of a very specific set of circumstances.
So is the real tragedy here that this young man made a series of terrible decisions that resulted in loss of life? And instead of using that experience to promote healing and understanding, he's become a pawn in a larger political game.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful way to put it. And it speaks to the broader challenge we face as a society. How do we have meaningful conversations about these complex and divisive issues without resorting to simplistic labels and demonizing those who hold different viewpoints?
It's like we're so afraid of nuance and ambiguity that we cling to these black and white narratives, even when the reality is much more complicated.
Right. And that ultimately prevents us from finding common ground and working together to address the underlying issues that are driving these divisions in the first place.
So after spending all this time unpacking the Kyle Rittenhouse story, I think the most important takeaway is that there are no easy answers here. This is a case that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world we live in.
It's a reminder that human beings are capable of both great good and great harm, and that understanding someone's actions requires us to consider a wide range of factors: their personal history, their beliefs, the social and political context in which they operate.
It's also a cautionary tale about the power of the media and the dangers of allowing ourselves to be manipulated by those who seek to exploit our emotions and fears for their own gain.
Absolutely. And perhaps most importantly, it's a call to action to engage in more thoughtful, nuanced, and compassionate dialogue about the issues that divide us.
So to those listening, we leave you with this. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking understanding. Don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions and to engage with those who hold different perspectives. Because only through open and honest dialogue can we hope to build a more just and equitable world.
I think that's a great note to end on.
That's it for our deep dive into the complicated and controversial case of Kyle Rittenhouse. As always, we encourage you to continue exploring these issues and to share your thoughts with us on social media. Until next time, stay curious.